Now, my dearest son, you have heard my breath, my word. Go, do what you are responsible for. The words of Our Lady of Guadalupe, La Morenita to Juan Diego, as recorded in the Nican Mopohua, chapter 1, line 37. My story of Guadalupe began well before I was born, with my parents' wedding on December 12, 1970. The date was arbitrary, chosen by my grandparents given its proximity to Christmas, arguably the most popular holiday in the Philippines. But they also hailed from Cebu, a former Spanish colonial outpost known for its sizable devotees to Guadalupe. Whatever their reasons, the decision exists among memories long forgotten. For most Filipinos, memory, perhaps more than land, grounds one's sense of home. I spent most of my life in diaspora. Artifacts and iconographies weave fragments of self into some cohesive narrative. The story of Guadalupe and its relevance or irrelevance to my family functioned in some way as one of these memorial anchors. While the Tepeyac account occupied a prominent place in this mythology, I learned later on that our Cebuano version featured its own set of characters, circumstances, and artifacts. It was to Juan Diego that La Morenita appeared, in a cave, by a water source. And like the great Nahuasir, our Juan was also indigenous, a trapper who eked out a living at the periphery of the colonial center. Much later, I will learn that an even more ancient Guadalupe thrived in the hills of Cáceres in Spain, mapped along familiar tropes. But this time, a black virgin appears before Gil Cordero, a campesino, a person of no circumstance. Guadalupe, it seems, is a collection of stories, meandering across continental and temporal gaps. Resonant with similar precepts, their implicit competition for authenticity, however, compels me to ask whose story gets told, and more importantly, why? For immigrants, memory and home are contentious mechanisms of belonging. Stories of the quote, old country are told over and again to allay threats of erasure. Whoever claims accuracy wields the power to validate one's existence. But perhaps we need to consider this impulse behind the insistence on what is real. Perhaps we need to interrogate this fetish for an original claim. To what extent do characters and artifacts like Juan Diego, Juan Digo, Gil Cordero, and the various Las Morenitas unravel the illusory singularity of a colonial narrative? Could we instead affirm multiple stories and so pierce through the suffocating discourse of empire? In the Nican Mopohua, La Morenita's words are also called breath. Rather than impose a singular claim, she draws in her forgotten people. At a time when colonial narratives condemned indigenous histories to oblivion, La Morenita animated their pueblo into a world where their stories actually mattered. Indeed, this weaving of speech and respiration might offer us a way to penetrate through the anxieties of our times. When Black lives asphyxiate beneath state-sanctioned violence, when the politicization of a pandemic leaves our bodies vulnerable to the contagion of breath. La Morenita's invitation breathes through the impermeability of power. Beside her, silenced bodies speak themselves to life. More than a counter-narrative, Guadalupe is a cacophony of voices. They cohere in between elusive moments and spaces. They evoke the same liminality to which we are drawn as an Advent people. Standing in anticipation of God's shalom, we claim the promise of a world to come, even as we contend with an arbitrary present. We retell our many stories over and over again, meandering into a world where bodies are revered, labor is honored, and truths are expansive rather than negotiable. To the extent that memory nestles the past into the present, it cannot but weave multiple stories into the other. And so, as an Advent people, like this Morenita, we attend closely to the words and breath of those who live in the interstice, the in between, the periphery, for theirs is the place of privileged unveiling. I may never know the real story behind my parents' decision to wed on the feast of Guadalupe, but its negligibility might well reveal the potency of a story to slip beyond the limits of a single narrative. This forgetting evokes a different kind of memory, an anamnesis, a recollection of a deeper truth at once familiar as it is revelatory. Attending to voices from the margins, might we more clearly discern the emergence of the Word made flesh, this breath, this ruah that will reanimate a world stifled by the paucity of its own imagination.